Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up, recent violence in India has put that country front and center in the news. I talk with an Indian writer and former UN diplomat about this larger-than-life nation next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. For 3 long days in November, the world watched a violent scenario unfold as terrorists struck at the heart of Mumbai, India, killing more than 170. For Dr. Shashi Tharoor, it was a, quote, savage irony, since Mumbai is known for its welcoming nature. Tharoor was a longtime United Nations diplomat who ran for UN Secretary General in 2006. He lost to the current leader of that agency, Ban Ki-moon, and is now working on economic development projects in India. Tharoor is also an author, having written 9 books, including his most recent, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. I spoke with him this summer when he was at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has brought together authors from all over the world. We talked about India, but first about his home for the past 30 years, the United Nations. Welcome to Idaho.
Thank you, Marcia.
Have you been here before?
No, first visit, first time, and really enjoying what little I've seen of it.
Great. Well, I want to start out talking a little bit about the United Nations. Although you're no longer there, you were for most of your career so far. You wanted to be Secretary General, in charge of the whole thing.
Right.
That sounds like an incredibly stressful job to me. Why did you want the job?
Well, because I'd actually seen it done at close quarters. I'd spent almost 29 years in the service of the United Nations, and I'd had an unusually varied career in that I'd been able to work in the humanitarian field, in political affairs and peacekeeping at the height of the sort of post-Cold War expansion of peacekeeping, in the Secretary General's own office alongside Kofi Annan. And so I really came prepared, as it were, for the whole range of tasks the UN had. And this is why my candidacy was welcomed by a number of countries, and I was the only other person other than the eventual winner to enjoy a majority in the Security Council. But at the end of the day, it was second, and as Groucho Marx used to say, close but no cigar. So I moved on.
You know, a lot of people question the relevancy of the United Nations, but you've said that the UN is absolutely essential to Americans' prosperity.
Absolutely, and for those who are interested, I have a rather lengthy piece in the fall 2003 Foreign Affairs explaining why, even in the wake of the then triumph in Baghdad and the fall of Baghdad, that the US still needed the UN there and beyond. I think my argument would go even beyond that today. I would stress that this is a world full of problems without passports, problems that cross all frontiers uninvited, problems ranging from terrorism, the environment, refugee movements, human rights issues, drug trafficking, human trafficking, you name it, problem after problem, which you can't fence in behind the borders of one country. Problems that no one country or one small group of countries, however rich and however powerful they may be, can solve on their own.
What about some of the folks, and you see them in this state, who have signs up that say U.S. out of UN, truly are worried, fearful of the United Nations taking over the world to the point where countries won't have sovereignty?
I'm really sorry to hear about these things, even in Idaho, because obviously it shows that ignorance, I'm afraid, is more widespread than it should be. The UN is not an extra sovereign power. In other words, it has no authority over its member states. It is an organization of member states. So to say, for example, that the UN can interfere with any sovereign member state against its own wishes is like saying that, that Madison Square Garden can interfere with the Knicks or whatever the local equivalent in Boise ought to be. I mean, it's a venue where countries don't give up their sovereignty, but they leverage their sovereignty in partnership with all the other sovereignties around the table in order to come up with solutions that they feel are in their interest and in the interest of the world.
What was it like during the beginning of the Iraq crisis, for you as both a diplomat and somebody who's lived in the United States, to watch that tension between the U.S. and the UN, which frankly came to an apex when Colin Powell spoke before the United Nations with all his gravitas, you know.
No, it was deeply saddening. I mean, of course, many of us at the UN were firmly believed that there was no effective UN without the US. And don't forget that going right back to the founding of the organization, it was very important in the eyes of everybody that the US had to be anchored in the UN. One of the reasons the League of Nations failed, the forerunner organization between the First and Second World Wars, was that the US didn't belong to it. So it was very important that the US be in the UN, but it's equally important that everybody else too belongs, because universality was the great strength of the UN. So to see a leading member like the UN, like the US, I beg your pardon, at odds with the rest of the members was deeply sad. Certainly those of us who also had a lot of respect for people like Hans Blix, the chief weapons inspector, Mohammad al-Baradei, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, the head of the Atomic Energy Agency, we took their assessments very seriously, and they clearly, neither of them felt that the non-cooperation of Iraq was sufficient to warrant the use of force. Indeed, whatever leads Mr. Blix was given by American and Western intelligence agencies saying, we think there are weapons of mass destruction in location X or location Z, these people went out and looked at those locations and found nothing. So we did at the UN in those days worry that the US might have really got the wrong end of the stick here.
And Colin Powell didn't convince you.
Well, he's a hugely impressive man, and many of us knew and liked and respected, and we wanted to believe him. But as I said, there were 3 or 4 others we also respected who believed otherwise. And in the end, I'm afraid, they turned out to be right. And Mr. Powell says this was one of the moments in his career that he's most ashamed of.
Let's move on to India. I know that when you were at the UN, you didn't get to spend as much time there as you might like to, and you do now get to spend more time. First, just the broad scenario. I think some people forget, and even I, until I reread history, this is a relatively new country. I mean, we think about all the thousands of years of wonderful history, but as a modern country, it's about the same age as Israel.
That's right.
About 60 years old.
That's correct. In fact, it's a curious sort of thing because, yes, India has had a sense of Indian civilization and culture going back 4,000 years, and that's a curious sort of thing to have in a modern republic that is 61 years old this month. The fact is that when Italy was created out of a jumble of principalities and statelets in the 19th century, an Italian nationalist memorably wrote, "We have created Italy. Now all we need to do is to create Italians." Now what's interesting is that no Indian nationalist would ever have said that, because the great Indian nationalist voices like Mahatma Gandhi or Jawaharlal Nehru believed in the existence of India and Indians for millennia before their movement gave a modern state, an expression, as it were, to the longings for freedom of the Indian people. But having said that, today we have a modern republic, which is an India in physical and geopolitical configuration that in that form didn't exist before. So it is a young country, and it's a country that's going through many of the pains that countries 60 years old have gone through in historical memory.
And the scale is enormous. I mean, you've called it a grand experiment, and not just a country, but a whole adventure. India is huge. It's going to surpass China in terms of population one day.
It will be. 2034 is what the demographers project will be the year when India overtakes China. Not something to look forward to in many ways. Though oddly enough, there is...
Why not?
Well, because frankly, that's more mouths to feed, and that's more people to accommodate, and more energy that you need to get sources off to consume, and all of that. But having said that, the truth is also that there is a demographic advantage India has that China doesn't and other countries except the US don't have, and that is that, you won't believe this, but 540 million people in my country are under the age of 25 today, which means that for the next 40 years, they'll be growing up to be a productive, dynamic, youthful workforce at a time when the rest of the world, except the US, but including China, is aging. So it could be an advantage to India, but they can only be an effective workforce if you educate them, feed, clothe and house them, and give them enough opportunities to make a difference in the world.